Chapter 7. Going Long. The most famous, and some say difficult, one-day endurance challenge in the world was sparked by a debate. It was 1977, and a group of runners were gathered for an award ceremony after a race in Honolulu, the Oahu Perimeter Relay Run. One of the participants, a U.S. Navy captain and runner named John Collins, had just read a magazine article proclaiming Belgian cycle champion Eddy Merckx the fittest athlete in the world. Others disagreed, maintaining that distance runners or swimmers were the best conditioned. We got into an argument, Collins recalled years later. The good-natured debate raged on until Collins had a brainstorm, and according to his recollections 25 years later, leapt on a stage and issued a challenge. To settle the question once and for all, he proposed a competition that would tie the three prominent swimming, biking, and running events then held in Hawaii: the 2.4-mile Waikiki Rough Water Swim, the 112-mile Around Oahu bike race, and the 26.2-mile Honolulu Marathon into one mega race. I said the gun will go off about 7 a.m., the clock will keep running, and whoever finishes first, we'll call the Ironman, Collins said. The following February 1978, 15 competitors, including Collins, competed in the first Ironman triathlon. Held on Oahu, the course followed the routes of the other three existing events. 12 of the 15, including Collins, went the entire distance. The winner, Gordon Holler, described as a taxicab driver and fitness enthusiast, won the first race in a time of 11 hours, 46 minutes, and 56 seconds. Collins himself finished in a little under 17 hours. At the start of that first race, each of the competitors received a handout with the course descriptions and some rules for the fledgling competition. On the last page was scribbled this call to action: swim 2.4 miles, bike 112 miles, run 26.2 miles, brag for the rest of your life. Eventually, thousands of people would come to Hawaii in an attempt to earn these bragging rights. The new competition caught on fast, helped in part by the media. Always attracted to stories about people doing crazy or extreme things, a feature in Sports Illustrated led to an ABC telecast in 1980. This generated interest in the Ironman around the world, and helped by inspiring televised images of athletes crawling across the finish line, eventually led to a worldwide series of 26 full or half-distance Ironman races from Lake Placid, New York, to Lanzarote in the Canary Islands. These events have soared in popularity to the point that registration now fills up a year in advance. Meanwhile, the Hawaii event, now known as the Ironman Triathlon World Championship, attracts an annual field of about 1,700 participants, including many professionals, a concept unheard of in 1978, not to mention a televised audience of millions who watched the annual Emmy-winning broadcast of the race, now carried by NBC. At age 21, I had sat enthralled in front of the TV in my apartment in Sylvania, watching the Ironman telecast from a far-off, exotic Hawaii, thinking what a great achievement it must be to finish. It seemed to me that this was the ultimate individual test in sports. I wondered whether I could do it. The fact that I was smoking crack while I was watching would suggest the answer was no, but that was then. By 1998, I had been sober 5 years. I was done with the storm and needed something else, a new sport or physical activity, not only to keep me fit, but also help fill the hours after work. Idle hands are the devil's playthings is a slogan that applies well to ex-addicts. We need to keep busy. We need to channel our addictive energies into something positive and away from the craving that still gnaws at us. With my hockey career over, triathlon seemed like that positive outlet to me. As was the case with my spending spree on goalie equipment when I joined the Storm, I only wanted the best for my new sport. I bought a $2,000 Cannondale bicycle on a crisp afternoon in April 1998 and went out for a ride in the neighborhood. I was excited. My first step toward being an Ironman, I thought. It was great until I was hit head-on by a car. The car had turned suddenly in front of me. I plowed into the right side of the grill, went rolling over the hood, and landed in the street on my keister. "Where did you come from?" I remember the driver asking as she rushed over to me. "Mommy," said her little daughter, who had run up beside her, "he was right in front of you." Meanwhile, her husband, who was not driving, looked frightened. "Don't move," he said. "Your leg is bleeding really badly. It doesn't look good." Great, I thought. I survived professional hockey to get a crippling injury riding my bike 2 blocks from my home. But then I realized that the husband was looking at the big dragon tattoo I have on my left calf. "I'm not hurt," I said, "but my bike probably is." It was smashed up, and while they were honest enough to pay for the cost of a new one, the accident spelled the end of my training for that year. My triathlon career, take 2. February 1999, I was resolved to try again. This time I decided to focus on the swim. I went to our local Vic Tanny's, which had a pool about 15 or 20 yards long. I jumped in at one end, started thrashing away, and by the time I got to the other end, I thought I was going to pass out. My pursuit of the great distances of the Ironman was going nowhere. How the hell was I going to swim a mile, much less 2.4 in an Ironman, if I could barely make 20 yards? But I was as determined to do a triathlon as I had once been to get myself wasted. I decided to apply a lesson I had learned in my recovery. I got help. I went to a former neighbor of mine, an outstanding swimmer, and asked him to show me how to swim. The guy was flabbergasted at first. Last time he had seen me, I was in the full throes of my addiction. In fact, he told me that was one of the reasons he had moved. "I couldn't stand watching you kill yourself," he said. Now that I had decided to stay alive, he was eager to assist. He accompanied me back to Vic Tanny's. We hopped in the pool together. He showed me proper technique and breathing. He made me realize that brute strength and will were not the answer here. Slowly but surely, I began feeling more comfortable in control in the water. Meanwhile, I was managing to ride my bike without colliding with any cars and was getting up at 5 a.m. to do my runs. They seemed very long at the time, 3 or 4 miles. I had a local Slovenia triathlon in mind as my goal, and I was psyched. I became consumed with the sport, learning as much as I could about it. While perusing the web one night, I came across some startling information. I had known about the Ironman in Hawaii, of course, but you had to qualify to get into that race. What I didn't know, and found out that night, was that there were other Ironman distance triathlons, including one in my old stomping grounds, Florida. "This is it," I told Melissa that night. "I am doing this." I signed up for Ironman Florida, which was being held in November 1999, about 8 months away. It cost me $350 for the privilege of going to kill myself. For good measure, I also signed up for Ironman California. I could barely swim. My longest runs were about 1/5 of the marathon distance, and I had already committed to doing 2 Ironman triathlons. Melissa was supportive, but not so my dad. "An Ironman?" he asked when I dropped by his office to tell him. "You don't even know how to swim." As always, being told I couldn't do something made me more determined to proceed. I got a program from a triathlon magazine and started planning. I didn't always follow it, as my enthusiasm ran away with me. In one case, literally so. At a point when I was supposed to be covering 8 to 10 miles in running, I went out and ran 17 miles in the rain just to see if I could do it. The soreness in my legs that hampered my training for the next week taught me an important lesson. Progress in triathlon is incremental. Again, I tried to equate it with recovery. As the old cliche goes, I was trying to stay sober, one day at a time. In my training, I was doing something similar, taking small daily steps towards my ultimate goal. A shorter race was a first step. I found a so-called sprint triathlon in the Wendy Sprint Triathlon in Columbus, Ohio, in June 1999. These are entry-level triathlons, generally consisting of a half-mile swim, 12-mile bike, and a 5K, or a 3.1-mile run. I was eager and excited, but not nervous. Considering my sporadic training, I felt good, finishing in about 1 hour and 30 minutes. I hasten to point out that the top sprint triathletes finish in less than 60 minutes. My finish time that day led me to another realization. Unlike hockey, triathlon didn't come so easily to me. I don't remember stumbling and falling on the ice as I learned to skate. I don't recall a time when a hockey stick in my hands didn't feel as comfortable as a pair of gloves. I rarely had to summon a great deal of effort to react to shots. It just seemed to happen. In triathlon, it was different. My body, well-sized to protect a net and present a small target in a rink, was not as well as proportioned for endurance activities. I didn't have the shoulders of the swimmer, the legs of a bicyclist, the lungs of a marathon runner. Even when it went relatively well, as it did in that first sprint triathlon, it was always a struggle at some level. And after that first race, as I watched the guys twice my age and many women leave me in the dust, I realized I would probably never be more than average in triathlon. At first I brooded about this, but not for long. I decided that I was more interested in being involved with this fascinating sport than being really proficient at it. Would it be fun to be world class in triathlon? Sure, but I had a fleeting taste of being pro in another sport, so being the best was not quite as important to me here. Besides, I knew I never would be. Still, I was pumped. Like many people who rush into endurance sports, I overtrained and the results were predictable. Near the end of summer, I started having some bad knee pains. My reaction was equally foreseeable. I tried to train through it. The pain got worse, and I finally had to see an orthopedist. He told me I had 3 tears in the meniscus of my left knee. I gobbled anti-inflammatories and moved on with my training, except I could only bike and swim, not run. On Halloween Day, 1999, we went trick-or-treating with our new 1-year-old daughter, Skylar. After she collected her fill of candy, we dropped her off with my parents, and Melissa and I headed down to Florida for what I'm sure to many in Sylvania seemed like the latest bizarre Crandall adventure. Our Honda Odyssey minivan was packed to the gills, although I couldn't help notice that unlike my last big trip down here in 1987, the trunk was filled not with cases of beer, booze, and carefully wrapped bags of cocaine and weed, but rather with all my triathlon gear, my racing bike and helmet, my wetsuit, my running shoes, and so forth. During my training, I had met another triathlete from Sylvania, Scott Horns, who had signed up for Florida as well. This would be his 3rd Ironman. He was actually good at this, and he would later become my coach. Melissa and I invited him to drive down with us. The 3 of us drove through the night, about 20 hours, arriving in Panama City, Florida, on a drizzly, overcast November morning. I brought my video camera along to soak up every minute of the Ironman experience. From my number pickup, I was number 636, to unpacking in our hotel room. There I am on video, spending hundreds of dollars on every piece of merchandise with the Ironman logo on it I could find. By the end of the trip, I would have Ironman shorts, shirts, watches, and I would even have an Ironman arm. I scheduled an appointment with a friend, tattoo artist Monk Taylor in Toledo, to have the logo emblazoned on my right arm the day after I returned, confident that I would finish. Some doubts crossed my mind the second day there when I went out for a swim in the ocean and found myself flailing around in huge waves. The weather was not good. My swim cap got knocked off, and they had the red flags out. Here I was, a guy from landlocked Ohio, faced with an angry Gulf of Mexico. I remember asking Scott, "Are we going to have to swim in this?" He said, "It's not so bad once you get past the first couple of swells." Either that, I thought, or you drowned. There was some good news. I was running pain-free, thanks to drugs, although not illegal ones this time. I had cortisone shot in my knee before we left, and the day before the race, I went for a short jog. Felt great. Hey, I thought to myself, I can run the marathon part of this pain-free. It was just one of many wrong assumptions I made that weekend. On race day, I arose at 4 a.m. My breakfast was a smoothie of bananas, protein powder, carrots, strawberries, pineapple juice, and yogurt, blended together as quietly as I could to keep from waking Melissa. I couldn't believe that I was about to do this. Packing for the Ironman is nearly as much of a challenge as training for it. I must have had a dozen bags of various sizes lying around the hotel, filled with all the stuff I needed: wetsuit, swim goggles and cap, timing chip, racing bike, towel, bike glasses, helmet, race number, bike shoes, bike top, bike lock, tire pump, extra bike tools, running shoes, running glasses, energy gels, Gatorade, bananas, power bars, salt tablets, and of course my Motley Crue CD to listen to and get pumped up. Walking out to the van looking like a triathlon pack mule, I was surprised to see a big poster stuck to the windshield of the van. The exhortation, "Go Todd," was written on it in big black letters. Melissa had created this after I fell asleep the previous evening. Again, I thanked my lucky stars that she had come along for the ride to Florida and to wherever else life was going to take us. I got down to the race site and started to walk around the body marking area. Sounds grim, but it's actually a line where volunteers use a special black marker to write your race number on your arm and leg. "I guess this is in case you drown they can identify the body," I joked to a guy standing next to me. He didn't laugh. You could hear the announcer welcoming everyone and soft music playing in the background. It was still dark, and a sense of quiet tension, balled-up anxiety was almost palpable. Quite obviously, everybody here was as nervous as I was, but there were still preparations to be made. With my race number 636 barely legible next to my various tattoos, I walked over to the bike station inside the transition area. This is the central staging area in triathlon, the point along the route where athletes change from swimming to bicycling and later from bicycling to running. Part changing room, part open-air equipment locker, it's the focal point of the event. Races are won and lost by how much time a triathlete takes in this area. Imagine losing a race because you never learned how to tie your shoes quickly enough. Fast transitions? Heck, fast anything were not my concern this morning. My goal was to finish and live to tell the tale. I needed to do everything methodically, carefully, within my comfort level. That included getting my equipment ready. I put my 16-ounce water bottles, filled with Gatorade, onto the holders mounted on the back of my bike seat, wiped the morning mist off the bike seat, pumped my tires one last time, placed my biking shoes on the toe clips, and stuffed my energy bars and gels into the little box that fastens onto the cross tube of the bike. Around me, hundreds of others were doing the same. Some of these people looked like their skin had been glazed over their muscles with a paintbrush. They were so lean, hard, and fit. I felt grateful, honored, and lucky to be here. While I couldn't compare myself to the hard bodies around me, I sure felt closer to them than to the person I had once been here. The guy who had prowled these beaches in search of drugs or spent days passed out on the beach. After finishing with my bike, I stripped out of my dry clothes, put on my wetsuit, grabbed my swim cap and goggles, and headed out to the transition area to find my wife, Melissa. We walked together down to the swim start just as the sun was coming up. A vivid orange sun was rising over what appeared to be a mercifully calm ocean, the rays illuminating the white sandy beaches. The swim course was marked with large orange buoys that stretched out so far you could hardly see them. It was a 1.2-mile swim course that we would do twice. That meant 1,700 people crammed into a relatively narrow swim lane. Mass swim starts are always dicey in triathlons. There's a lot of heads being kicked and people swimming over one another. As the music got louder and more up-tempo, I began to get nervous. Could I go the distance? Had I trained properly? What if someone kicked me in the face in the first 100 yards and that was the end of my race? Boom! The cannon fired, the race was on, and I remember thinking, there was no turning back now, just do it. The first few 100 yards were intense, with arms and legs flying everywhere. Triathletes often describe it as feeling as if they're in a washing machine, but eventually the crowds opened up. While the taste of salt water was foreign to my Midwest mouth, I soon found my space and settled into a groove. 2 strokes. Breathe out of the left side. Slow flutter kick. I puttered along like this back and forth for the 2 1.2-mile loops, finishing the swim in 1 hour, 11 minutes. By comparison, the first athletes out of the water in an Ironman are usually done in 48 to 52 minutes. Out of the water, we came up on the beach for 50 or 60 yards, through a timing chute into the transition area. I grabbed my bike clothes off the rack and went into the changing tent. I'd never before seen so many people in a state of undress. I stripped off my wetsuit, pulled up my biking shorts, put on my jersey and helmet, raced out of the tent to my bike, and started on my 112-mile journey in the Florida sunshine. This is the single longest stretch of the Ironman, and I had to settle in for what would amount to over 6 hours of cycling. The first 4 hours flew by. The course was flat, the weather warm and sunny. This is great, I remember thinking as we blasted up Highway 79. Maybe this isn't going to be as bad as everybody says. That changed after about 80 miles. I began to feel tired. I began to feel the heat. I began to feel cramps in my legs. I began to feel, as some of the old-timers say, as if the bear had jumped on my back. Now my glycogen stores were beginning to get depleted despite my frantic attempts to keep the tank reasonably full with Gatorade, bananas, and power bars. Now I just couldn't wait to get off that damn bike. 30 miles left. I tried to visualize crossing the finish line, still over 57 miles away, which in retrospect was not such a good thing to focus on, as I continued struggling through the last miles of the bike leg. Finally, after 6 hours and 11 minutes, I pulled into the transition area. I now had been moving continually for nearly 8 hours, a full day's work, and I still had a marathon to run. My legs stiff from riding for all that time, I gingerly climbed off the bike, handed it to a volunteer who racked it for me, and then jogged back to the changing room to lace on my running shoes. As I shuffled out of the transition area, I spotted Melissa, waving and cheering for me. That pumped me up for the first couple miles of the run. At about mile 4, however, my knee pain returned as the cortisone shot wore off. It got worse and worse. Then my lower back began to ache, reducing me to a walk. I started to second-guess this whole idea. What was I doing here? I didn't need to be doing this to prove anything or even to stay in shape. This was beyond fitness. This was madness. I heard cheering. I looked up and saw 2 attractive girls standing on the balcony of their condo, looking down at us. "I'm dying," I called out. "Give me some inspiration." One of them pulled up her shirt and shook her ample breasts. I couldn't believe it. A guy behind me started laughing. "That was awesome," he said. "Thanks." The light, or was it lewd, moment relaxed me enough to take my mind off the pain. I was able to start running for a while, before being reduced again to a walk. That's the way it went for the next 15 miles as I settled into a death march-like ratio. A slow, cramped jog for 5 minutes, then a staggering walk for 10 minutes. At mile 20, 6.2 miles to go in the entire race, I saw Melissa. "What the hell is taking you so long?" she called out. This had become her signature line at every race I've done since, and we laugh about it. That day in Florida, however, she was genuinely concerned. She came out on the course and jogged with me for a bit as I struggled on. But I told her to go back to the finish line and wait. "I'll be there soon," I said. There is a cutoff time in the Ironman. After 17 hours, you are not an official finisher. I was determined to make it across the line before then, and as I got closer and closer, I realized I would make it. At mile 25, I could hear cheering in the distance, and the announcer's voice over the loudspeaker announcing the names of finishers as they crossed the line. I started to run again. It was now about 8:30 p.m. I had been racing since 7 a.m. and on my feet since 2:30 in the afternoon, a horribly slow, painful marathon. The finish area was brightly lit, and I squinted in the floodlights after being in darkness for so long. Race organizers had laid out a carpet for the last 25 yards, and these were 25 of the best yards of my life. I was floating at this point, surrounded by people wildly screaming, music, a wall of noise erected in what had been a desert of silence and pain. And then an almost surreal moment, a voice calling my name. It was the race announcer, and he was saying something as if out of a dream now come true. "Todd Crandall," I heard as I staggered across the finish line in 14 hours, 12 minutes, and right into Melissa's arms. "You are an Ironman."